Welcome back, everyone, to Reading Hebrew. We are following along with the first Hebrew primer. We are on chapter 4, and this week we are going over nouns and verbs, some of the masculine ones. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So right away we have a vocabulary list, which from now on all the chapters will start with a vocabulary list, which is nice. Get to learn some new words and get to play with them a little bit. And I'm going to go through these. I'm not going to read the English. I'm just going to read the Hebrew for this list so we can get familiar with the general pronunciation of how you would say these. So I'm going to start in the top right, which is where we always start when reading Hebrew. And I'm just going to go through these. Avraham, Ish, Bait, Bain, Davar, David, Hu, Zachar, Malach, Melech, Na'ar, Amad, Shema, Shamar. You'll notice on a few of those the accent is placed at a different spot than what we're used to. For instance, the word Bayit, it's not Bayit, it is Bayit. Because you have the accent over the first letter, and I apologize, I don't have it here on the slide, but it is in the book, so you should see it there. Also, Melech, which is king, and Na'ar, young man, also have the accent on the first syllable. So that's the vocabulary for this chapter. Next, we're going to talk about the Hebrew sentence. And similar to English, a sentence expresses a complete thought. It includes at least a subject and a verb. So a couple examples that they give in the book is David remembered, which would be David Zachar, and he stood, which is Hu Amad. Pretty simple. You just match the subject with the verb, and in these sentences, those are really easy to figure out because there's only two words in those sentences. But something else that we will touch on more when we start diving into verbs more specifically is that unlike in English, in Hebrew, you can have the person, gender, and number within the verb. You don't really have that in English. Verbs kind of stand by themselves, and you have to attach a pronoun or a noun as a separate word in English to know who you're talking about. For instance, in an English verb like walk, if I just say walk, you would have no idea if I was referring to a person, if I was saying that as like a command, like I'm telling you to walk, or if I'm talking about like I am walking. But in Hebrew, each verb has several things going on, but to keep it simple, you have a person, a gender, a number. For instance, first person, I, second person, you, third person, he or she. You have gender, masculine or feminine. And then you have number, which would be singular or plural. So, for example, in this sentence here, and David remembered, I'm just going to hover over this. This word Zachar, this is the third person masculine singular form. So if there was a sentence in Hebrew with just a verb, which can happen because you have a subject and a verb together within the verb form. So you can have a complete thought within one word. This word by itself is literally he remembered, which is a complete thought. It is a sentence. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. You don't need to know it right now, but just as a heads up. And we'll, get into parsing verbs and all that later. But just, for now, we're dealing with this type of verb. So all the verbs in this chapter are going to be third person masculine singular. Again, the chapter doesn't talk about that because it's not necessary right now, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. So this is a Hebrew sentence. David remembered, David Zachar, and he stood, Hu Amad. And I just realized that that's a chet. It should be a hey. My apologies. Also in Hebrew, the verb usually precedes the subject. That's not always true. For example, in the first few chapters of this book, when it starts dealing with it, the verb is going to follow the subject just to make it easier for us to read because as English speakers, that's what we're used to. You don't start a sentence with a verb. You usually start it with the subject, but in Hebrew, a lot of sentences start with a verb. At the very least, the verb will be before the subject. Sometimes, like in later chapters in the book, because this does happen in the Hebrew text, there can be several nouns that you're given in a sentence right away, and then the verbs all come later, or the verbs all come first, and then the nouns come after, and you have to figure out what they're all referring to. So sentences in Hebrew can be a bit jumbled. So this is an example that they give. It's the same sentence David remembered. However, it's ordered Zachar David, which means the same thing. You still have David as the subject, and you still have Zachar as the verb. So, in Hebrew, a lot of times you'll see it written like this, Zachar David. So don't get too confused by that. And there are several ways of knowing, the subject versus the object of a sentence, which again, I'm kind of jumping into that early. That all comes later. But for now, don't be confused if you see in the exercises the verb coming before the subject. That's how Hebrew usually does it. So obviously the subject of a sentence is going to be a noun or a pronoun. This book really gets in depth with some of this stuff, and I'm just going over it, even though for many of us this is going to be, pretty basic, nothing really crazy going on here, and it's like, your first English class in elementary school, but here we are with Hebrew. So in this chapter we were given several nouns and pronouns. As for nouns, these are some of the ones that the chapter gives us. This isn't all of them, but we have David, Davar, which is a word or thing, Bain, which is son, Bait, house, Ish, man, and Avraham, which is Abraham. These are nouns, and we were given one pronoun, which a pronoun is a stand-in for a noun, which is who, which is the word he. If you remember a couple videos ago, I made the joke, in Hebrew, who is he and he is she. So that's a good way to remember it. We get into the feminine words in the next chapter, but for this one, we have the pronoun who, which means he. And I apologize, there's a bird right outside my window that is chirping like mad right now. Also, this is another side note. I've begun several of these this video, but as a side note, Hebrew words only have two genders. You have masculine and feminine. In English, most words are not gendered. I actually think in English, the way it functions is it's not gendered language at all. We don't categorize our words between masculine, feminine, or neutered. Like in Greek words are either masculine, feminine, or neutered. And it's how they're written. In Spanish, it's masculine or feminine. In Hebrew, is similar to Spanish in that way, in that words are either masculine or feminine. And this, again, is not important now, but in later chapters it affects how we read and write plural of words. It also affects how we do verbs. So this chapter is going over the masculine nouns and verbs, some of them. The next chapter is going over feminine, and this is just sort of giving you a heads up. In Hebrew, there's only masculine and feminine. So these are just, these nouns and pronouns that we're looking at here, these are all masculine nouns and pronouns. Next, we're going to look at verbs. Verbs obviously describe the action of a sentence. In this chapter, we were given 5 verbs. So these are 5 verbs that we now know. So congratulations, you now know nouns and verbs, so you can read a Hebrew sentence, which is some of the exercises. So we have here, these are all the verbs the chapter gives us: shamar, shema, amad, malach, and zachar. So we have guard, hear, stand, rule or reign, and remember. But there's something else about these verbs that's important to know. And that is that all of these verbs that the chapter has given us are in what's called the perfect tense. So in English, verbs come in 3 different tenses. You have past, present, and future. You have what happened, what is happening, and what will happen. That's how English treats verbs. Hebrew's different in that there's only really two tenses in Hebrew. You have perfect and imperfect. Well, what does that mean? Well, the perfect tense, which is the tense that these verbs that we've just learned are part of, refers to action that is completed. So, for example, let's look at this sentence. Let's look at the Hebrew here on the right. David shamar. Now, there's several ways you could actually translate this, because this is the perfect tense, and perfect tense is action that is completed. So here's the examples that the book gives us. This could mean David guarded. It could also mean David did guard, David had guarded, David was guarding, David has guarded. These are all ways you could translate this that refers to an action that is completed. It is no longer happening. It's something that already took place. It is completed action, and that is the perfect tense. The other tense in Hebrew, the imperfect tense, so imperfect refers to action that is not completed. So if this sentence was referring to, and if this was an imperfect verb, for example, if it was, David, and then an imperfect form of shamar, it would be like David is guarding, David will guard, David has been guarding, words, that's a pretty complex construction. But the imperfect is action that is not completed, and perfect is action that is completed. And obviously I just have a note here. This creates a lot of room for interpretation. But don't let that intimidate you. Context usually will tell you the best way to interpret what's going on. And this also leads into something else with reading Hebrew, and really this is true with learning any language, is that when you actually start translating and you're reading the Hebrew and you are translating it into English, the most important thing to keep in mind is trying to understand the essence of what is written. You're not trying to come up with a one-to-one translation of translating every single word directly. What you're really trying to do is understand what is the concept of a sentence, for example. What is the idea this sentence is trying to communicate? And that's really what you want to look at. And so that's why, I've seen students who get really frustrated with a sentence like this, David shamar, because they're trying to say, well, there's so many different ways you could translate this word shamar, and I just don't know how to do it. Well, read it in context, and the context will generally help you understand the concept of what's trying to be communicated, and then that will give you a better translation. And in a lot of cases, the best translation is not going to be a direct word-for-word translation. The best translation is going to be one that communicates the intent of the author. And once we start getting more into Hebrew, that'll become more obvious. This is just sort of an example where if you're trying to learn Hebrew to learn direct word-for-word translation, you're going to end up with a lot of different possibilities, which for some people can be very frustrating. But that will come when when it comes. So next we're going to look at the definite article. So in English we have both a definite article, which we use the, and we have an indefinite article, which is either a or an. So for example, if I were to say I live in a white house, that's pretty vague. Okay, you live in a white house. What is that talking about? But if I were to say I live in the White House with a definite article, well, everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? I live in the White House. Okay, I don't actually live in the White House, but as an example, that's the difference between definite and indefinite. Pretty self-explanatory. But in Hebrew, there are no indefinite articles. Nouns are indefinite by nature, so they don't need an indefinite article. But there is a definite article, and this is the construction for it. At the beginning of a word, the way a noun becomes definite is that it starts with a hey, with a patak beneath it, and then there's a dagesh in the following letter, which is the first letter of the word's base noun form. So for example, you have this word, which is the king, which the regular spelling of it is a mem without a dagesh, and it's melech. Right? That's how you would say a king, which is indefinite. But if you want to make the word king definite, you have a hey with a patak underneath it, and this dagesh in the first letter. So that's how you know this is a definite article attached to a noun. And this is why it's really important to learn the vocabulary so that whenever there is a definite hey, you can notice it right away. Because you know what the root word is, and you can tell that there's a prefix going on here. So this is the king. But it is important to know that some consonants can't take a dagesh. And there's 5 letters that can't take a dagesh. You have the aleph, hey, a chet, an ayin, and a resh. These letters cannot take a dagesh. So in those cases, when there is a definite hey attached to it, the hey has to adjust its vowel. So, for example, we have this word, which is the man, which is ha'ish. But you'll notice that unlike the construction that we learned how to do with a definite hey, this hey does not have a patak. It has a kametz. Well, why is that? Well, the way I think of it is when you're dealing with the definite hey, the hey has a patak, and then the hey also sends a dagesh to the next letter. Well, if the next letter can't take a dagesh, then the hey retains it, so to speak, and then its own vowel changes because of that. Because the dagesh has to go somewhere. There has to be some change. And if the next letter can't take that change, then the hey changes. So that's why, in this example, the man, you have the base form ish, which would be a man, but then you have the definite article hey, with usually a patak, but it becomes a kametz because the dagesh can't go to the aleph, so the dagesh changes the hey. It's not always going to be a kametz. Sometimes it's a segal, but usually it's a kametz, and usually you can tell by knowing the root word, you can tell that this is a definite hey that's happening here. But this is just a note to say that it doesn't always look like this. In most cases it will. That's why this is the rule and this is the exception. But that's just something to keep in mind. And that's how the definite article works. And similar to English, some nouns are definite by nature, such as names or places. So for instance, in this chapter we learned the name Avraham, we learned David. We also know, I used this as an example in a previous video, Yisrael. Right, so these are definite by nature. When we talk about Abraham, well, we know who we're talking about. We don't have to specify. Same thing with David, same thing with Israel. Right, like we don't walk around saying, oh, I talked with the Brian or the Jeff the other day. We don't have to do that. Just say I talked with Brian or I talked with Jeff. Right? We all know who I would be talking about in that case. Same thing with Hebrew. So we don't have Ha Avraham or Ha David or Ha Yisrael. That would just be redundant and totally unnecessary. So these words are definite by nature. And that really concludes this chapter. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There is a lot to chew on, though. A lot to process and get used to. So that's why for the exercises for this chapter, I would recommend doing all of them. It was just good practice. This is stuff that you really want to nail down and really get a strong grasp of right off the bat. It's going to help a lot when we start getting into more complex sentence structures and when we start talking about verbs more. You really want to know all of these concepts because they're going to come up a lot. So it's good basics to know. So I would do all the exercises. And that would wrap it up for this week. Next week we are going to go over the feminine nouns and verbs. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week.